July 29th of 2002, and we are here at ASU at the Visitor Information Center at Rural Road in Apache, doing a series of interviews for the Arizona State University Retiree Association Living History Video Project. And I'd like to have you introduce yourself so that we get your name pronounced correctly, and maybe just tell us what your title was when you retired at ASU. We'll go back to the beginning or later.
Well, you'll go back to the beginning. You'll go back a long way. I'm Bob Ellis, and when I retired, I was Associate Vice President at ASU in University Relations.
And then why don't we start at the very beginning and tell me when you were born and where you were born.
Well, my sister and I were born in Cleveland, Ohio. We were children of the Depression. I was born in 1928 and she was born in 1921. My father worked for the Guardian Bank at Cleveland, and FDR closed all the banks, and my dad lost his job and was out of work 6 years. And during that period of time, I don't know how my parents managed to do this, but I never lost a meal. There was never a time when we didn't have food on the table. There were always gifts and presents at Christmas time and on my birthday. But sadly, my dad died when he was 46 years old in 1938. So my sister, my mother, and I went to live with my grandparents, and we lived there for 6 years. I graduated from high school in Cleveland and went in the Army. And if you'd like to hear about my Army exploits, there weren't many.
Well, it sounds like your growing up years were a difficult time. Why don't we talk a little bit about what you remember of those years?
They really weren't that difficult because my grandparents really took care of us. And as I say, I don't know how my parents did it, but during the Depression, we lost our houses. We had 3 houses. We had a 1929 Buick, a brand new Buick, that wound up on blocks in the driveway. My dad had a boat that we took to Lake Erie every summer, and we lost that. But he managed to keep our 16mm camera and tapes, and well, they were films then. And so I have films of when I was 2 to 6, 7 years old. And my sister and I are very, very grateful that they didn't sell those. Not very valuable, but we also had a great family. And my uncles, my aunts. I was supposed to be the 3rd generation to go to work for the Cleveland Electric Illuminating Company. My grandfather started with the company and worked there for 55 years in the same position. He was superintendent of the electrical division. My uncle worked there for 30 years, and I was going to be the 3rd generation. It didn't quite work out that way. So,
how did it work out differently?
Well, after I got out of the service, I came to Arizona to visit my sister, who had married a Phoenician. And I took my severance pay, $60 or so, got on a Greyhound bus and came out here. There was a fellow that I went through school with that also went in the service with me at the same time, who contacted rheumatic fever. And he was going through recuperation at the Pabico Hospital, which no longer exists. And he told me about Arizona State College. So I decided to come out and take a look. So I drove from 28th Avenue in Van Buren, and I stopped at this huge campus, and there were, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 kids there, but they were kids. They were like, 14, 15. I thought, what kind of a university is it? I stopped off at Phoenix Union High School by mistake, and went on to Arizona State College, and there were only 2,500 students here. So I started school in 1948, and with the exception of a couple of years, I never left Arizona.
Let's back up a little bit and talk about growing up. Were you a good student?
I was a terrible student, but I loved high school. I was kicked out of high school 5 times. Very, very terrible things that we did. The basketball team came up. out of practice one day and went up to the cafeteria, and there were some pies out, and you couldn't resist them. So we started to eat the pies. We got caught. That was one time I got kicked out. I loved high school, and I still have friends that I played ball with, and we stay in contact with each other.
What sports did you play in high school?
I tried to play football, and I managed to get hurting my knee, so I wound up not playing football. I tried to play basketball. That was a vain attempt. I was too small. When I graduated from high school, I was 5'2", and I weighed about 120 pounds. And now I'm 5'10", and I'm not going to tell you how much I weigh. But I did know all the kids that played ball and hung out with them and had a great time.
And how did you get kicked out of school the other 3 times?
Well, I did manage the football team, and I got a letter for that. And one day I was shooting pool at the local pool room with my letter sweater on, and the dean of students saw me there, and that was another time I kicked out. I don't know if you had study halls. We had study halls. You had to go to the study halls. But there were ways of getting out of study halls. For instance, you could sign up for chorus, and you could get out of study hall. And I got called into the office one day, and they must have had 100 study hall slips that I had presented and never went to the study hall, and I never went to the classes I said I was going to, so I was kicked out again. Now, you may wonder how I managed to stay in school. They always said, you have to bring your mother. And I said, well, I can't do that because my mother is working in the defense industry, and this was during the first part of World War II. And so they kept excusing me because my mother was working in the defense industry. When I graduated, the assistant principal said to my mother, how is work at General Electric? And she said, I don't work there. I work at Southam's Jewelers. I had got my diploma by that time.
Well, you would have been kicked out again.
Yeah.
So what year did you graduate from high school?
I graduated in 1946. I went in the service right after I graduated.
So you missed World War II as a serviceman.
But I was still drafted. And because of that, I was eligible for the GI Bill. That's one of the things I could take advantage of coming to ASC. I had the GI Bill.
So where did you serve during your years in?
Fort Knox, Kentucky. That's it. I was there for a year and a half.
So you never went overseas?
No, thank goodness.
No combat duty?
Mm-mm.
Okay. So through these years of high school, what did you plan to do when you grew up and graduated?
I was going to work for the Cleveland Electric Illuminating Company. That's what the plan was. But as I say, it didn't come out that way because I came out here.
Tell us again, why did you want to come to Arizona?
Because my sister was here. And I just came to visit her and wound up going to school in 1948. And it was quite a different place then than it is now.
Can you describe a little bit what it was like when you first, you said you went to Phoenix Union by mistake. What was ASU like when you finally found it?
Well, the great advantage of going to Arizona State College then was it was small. There were about 2,500 students. You got to know practically everybody in the student body. You really got to understand what your professors were like. They invited you sometimes to their homes for dinner. And I think that you really realized that what camaraderie was all about. Now, the great disadvantage was that it was small. And the faculty was good, but not really distinguished. And because of the sudden influx of GIs, it was sometimes hard to get in the classes you wanted to get into. If you were from back east like I was, and you told somebody you went to Arizona State College at Tempe, the reaction was, where's Temp? Or is that the University of Tucson? We really were not well known in those days. So the advantage was it was small, the disadvantage was that it was small.
And What were you majoring in when you came here?
I majored in speech and drama. Another disadvantage was that this has been a teacher's college, and there wasn't much research going on in the university, and as a result, you probably would wind up majoring in elementary or secondary education. So I was in secondary education with an emphasis in speech and drama.
And what did you intend to do with that?
I had no idea. Again, I just enjoyed myself because it was small and you wanted to go in extracurricular activities. You could participate in the choir, which I did. You could go into debate with Dean McSloy as your professor, or you can go into drama with Frank Byers. So I tried all of them.
What did you think of Arizona when your first experience out here?
Oh, it was wonderful because I came in November. And then I went back to Cleveland in May, so I didn't experience those terrible summers for 3 years. And then when I finally experienced those terrible summers, I thought this is an awful place to live. But other things happened to me at that time, unexpected consequences that made me want to stay here.
Well, why don't you tell us about some of those things? Why did you decide then you were going to school for 4 years, 3 years? Or?
5. I graduated in '53, and I went to work for KOI Radio. And unexpected experiences, consequences. I was hired to work in the continuity department. I had no idea what that meant. I found out later it meant writing commercials. It just so happened there was a very attractive, beautiful, smart woman who was single that ran that department. And I was immediately attracted to her, and I have no idea why she went out with me. But Frankie Joe Lanter was my boss. I wound up fortunately marrying her, and next week we'll be celebrating our 48th anniversary. So that's why I stayed here. She was from this area.
So when did you marry her?
I married her in 1954, August the 7th, 1954, and that's a date that I don't want to forget.
And so you met her working at KOI.
Yeah.
Did you plan to make radio your career by then?
Yeah, and I worked there for 7 years. What happened was a friend of mine that I went to school with, that graduated in 1953, Jim Loper, stayed on in what was known as the broadcasting department then, the Bureau of Broadcasting, and his boss was Dr. Richard Bell. They had this great idea to start a television station. Other public, well, it was non-commercial educational television stations then, had been started. The first one was at the University of Houston. They had one at Lincoln. Most of them started at universities, and the idea was they would be able to offer telecourses on the air, and students wouldn't have to come to campus to take those courses. So it was really a non-commercial educational facility. Jim asked me if I would come over and help in the radio area, and I took a cut in salary, but they were getting the station on the air, so I came over here. Station went on the air. I came over in '59. Station went on the air January 30th, 1961. You might say, why January 30th? Why not the 31st or February 1st? The semester started on January 30th. Surprisingly, Dick left in June. He went to the University of Colorado. He spent several years trying to get the station started, and then he suddenly left. Jim had left to go back to go to USC, where he did some of his master's degree work and wanted to get his PhD. He left and never came back, and guess what I inherited? I inherited Channel 8. And that was in 1961, and I stayed on as general manager until 1987, and actually the station reported to me from 87 to 90 when I was in university relations. So I was affiliated with the station, the beginning of it, for about 30 years.
I'm going to back up a little bit and start back at when you went to work at KOI. Tell me, what was KOI like then?
There were two major radio stations in town, KTAR and KOY. KOY had been a CBS affiliate, and they lost the affiliation to a new station, Cool, that was run by Tom Chauncey. So KOY became a Mutual Don Lee affiliate, and they had to reinvent themselves. They had relied on network programming up until this time, but when I came on the scene, the reason they needed more staff is they went to a local format. We had Rise and Shine in the morning, we had Bob Capps and from midnight to 6 o'clock in the morning. Frankie Joe and I had a program called His and Hers. So it was a lot of local programming, and you learned a lot about talking to the community at that time. The other interesting thing was KOY was going to go into the television business. They finally did. They and Cool merged for a television facility, Channel 10, and eventually Cool bought them out. So yeah, it was a different station and a wonderful place to live in. In the morning, from 6 o'clock until 9, our ratings at that time were over half of the ratings in town. In other words, more than 50% of the audience, available audience, listened to us in the morning. And if you made a mistake, you got letters.
And who were some of the key people that were on the air at that time?
Well,
a couple of them.
Bill Close, who later on went to Channel 10 and became a news anchor there. Bill was the news director. Paul Ribbon, who you probably never heard of, was also in the news department. Bill Lester was assistant program director, and he had several programs on the air. Johnny Holliday, which was a pseudonym, his name was Johnny Hetherington, but Jack Williams was the owner and program director of the station, and Jack later became governor. There's another story there that maybe I'll have time, I'll tell you. Bob Capps, we had a lot, John Johnson, Jim Murdoch. We had a lot of disc jockeys on the air at that time.
Okay. So you were there for what, 5 years? Or?
I was there for 7 years. I was there from 1953 until 1959 when I came over here, but I went back and worked part-time for them for 2 or 3 years after that.
And so was that a big decision then to leave that?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, we had 2 children by that time, and I told Frankie Joe that I really wanted to try a hand at television, and I took a cut in salary, but I said I could make that up for that if I worked at KOY part-time. So I wound up working 7 days a week. I rarely saw the kids. I worked over at the university, and then on Friday night I worked at KOY. On Saturday morning and Sunday morning I worked there. I did the dog races, the greyhound races with Bill Close. I did those 3 nights a week. So I wasn't home a lot during those first few years that I worked here.
Well, you say you took a cut in salary. What were salaries like back then?
I think that I probably was making around $7,000 a year, and I would guess it was $4,000 or $5,000 a year to come over here.
Tell me again why you were willing to take a cut in salary.
Well, as I say, they were getting television station started, and that enticed me. And I thought there was some opportunities here. I thought maybe I could take a hand at teaching, and eventually maybe I would get tenure. And all that happened.
So tell me about the station, how it got started and how it got its call letters and its station number and all that.
Well, the station number was assigned by the FCC. Now, you have to go back and recognize that at that time, in 1959, the only stations on the air were Channel 5, which was KPHO, Channel 12, which was KVAR, and then Channel 3 came on the air a little later, and Channel 10. So those were the stations, 4 stations. Channel 8 fit right in the middle of that spectrum. So we went on the air, and we're on the air 5 days a week, mainly with telecourses. And since we were located where we were located, and there wasn't remote control, you had to flip the dial past us to get from 5 to 10. And every once in a while, people would stop. And we managed to get an audience, even though we didn't have much of a signal out there. That was in 1961, and we were offering telecourses. We were successful with only one course, and that was Kino Martinez Spanish 101 and 102. I think there were maybe 15 students registered for it, but he sold 5,000 syllabus. So there were people watching us at that time. Not many, but a few.
5,000 is pretty good for
Yeah,
back then.
at that time, yeah.
So how did you get the call letters?
Call letters stand, we didn't want KAET, we wanted KASU. And that was not available because that was a FM station at Arkansas State University. So we settled for AET, which stands for Arizona Educational Television. Nobody realizes that now. It's a hard call letter, KAET, but we're still stuck with it.
Now, at that time, the commercial stations, like you said, there was a battle between KOY and Cool trying to get one station. How did the university get a station?
When the station went on the air, well, let's go back a minute. Grady Gamage was president, and as my understanding, he told Dick they could apply for a license once they had a foundation of funding from other than university sources. Dick managed to get a grant from the McCune Foundation. I think it was maybe $80,000, and Grady Gamage said they would match that. So they had enough money to get on the air. They applied for the license, got the license, and as I said, went on the air in '61. Now, the interesting thing to me is they didn't have enough money for a new tower or transmitter. Channel 12 was going to increase power. So they had to get a new transmitter and tower and antenna. And Dick bought their old tower, transmitter, and antenna. I think he paid $35,000 for it. The signal wasn't very good, and later on we had to take the transmitter out and put in a new transmitter tower and antenna. But KVAR, Dick Lewis, at that time really helped them get on the air.
Now, you're saying there were just a few other stations. There wasn't the kind of public television that we think of.
No, it was non-commercial educational television. And there were a few programs that were produced around the country, and they were recycled at Ann Arbor. The National Educational Television Radio Center was in Ann Arbor. A program was produced by, let's say, WGBH in Boston. It would go to Ann Arbor, and they would make copies. They couldn't make enough copies for all the 40 or 50 stations that were on the air, so maybe they make 5 or 10 copies, and they would go to one station by the mail. We weren't interconnected, and then you would take that program and you would send it to another station that would send it to another station. But as a result, you couldn't have a lot of good promotion because you couldn't say that such and such program, The Age of Kings, for instance, was going to be on the air nationwide on Monday night at 9 o'clock because it might be on the air in New York at 9 o'clock on Monday night, and it might be on the air here at Friday night. So it was a cumbersome system, but somehow it seemed to work. You may understand that this was all really difficult and shoestring operations in many places. It wasn't until Lyndon Johnson became president that they were able to get a bill through Congress to support public radio and public television. That was the Great Society Act of 1967, and that, as a result of that, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was formed, and that was followed by PBS.
Well, Tell me about what it was like when you first came. What was your title when you in the job? What did you do?
See,
when
I
you
think
first
my
came?
title was news director or something, and my job was to produce radio programs for radio stations throughout the state. So we produced maybe 5 or 6 programs, ASU News, Sports, Western Business Roundup, a College of Business program. These were recycled to the 50 or so radio stations throughout the state, and that was my job. You know, Arizona State was a quaint operation at that time. Yeah, if you go back to the 50s, you walk down College Avenue at, say, 9:45 at night, and there'd be cars parked in front of the quadrangle. That'd be North, South, and West Hall. And there would be some necking going on in those, that's what we called it then, in those cars, and smoke would be filtering out through the windows because the thing to do was to smoke. And then about 5 minutes of 10, the girls would run into the dorm because there was a curfew. It's hard to believe that that really happened, and these were not co-ed dorms, and every once in a while you would hear a shout, "Man in the hall," which meant some guy had wandered through one of the halls and was caught. Then the guys in the cars would leave at 10 o'clock and they would wind up at a local pub, maybe the Hut downtown or someplace. The whole school operated that way for a number of years, and even in the late 50s and early 60s when Channel 8 was going on the air, it still was a relatively small campus. And because the faculty was interested in going on the air, some of them, we were able to offer 10 or 15 telecourses every semester. It worked out fairly well, but the telecourses were not to the students' liking. They just hated the idea of taking a course via a television station and not seeing the professor. And now you take a look at what's going on the internet. A lot of the courses are offered that way now.
It's finally arrived.
Yeah.
How did it change when the TV station went on the air? How did your job change then?
Well, when the station went on the air, as I say, I was news director, and we did have a half-hour newscast every evening. And I did all the announcing for the station. We couldn't hire an announcing. We only had about, well, maybe 5 or 6 staff members. We had Chuck Allen, who is now manager of the station, Shel Siegel, myself, Lynn Dreyer, an engineer, and maybe a producer and a couple of secretaries. So a very small staff, but we relied on the students. And we always had 20 to 40 students that worked at the station. And we put a lot of them on the air. Al Michaels, who now does the Monday night football games, was a student, and he did some of the sports programming on Channel 8. It was very different at that time, and then it progressed because the telecourses started fading. PBS came on the air, we got interconnected, and we kind of forgot about telecourses as an over-the-air medium, and not too many stations are offering them that way anymore.
Describe for me what the station was like when the TV station went on the air. Where was it located? What was the studio like?
It was located in the engineering center in a very small studio. Again, Dick took advantage of what was available. The engineering center was being built at the time he applied for the license. So the end result was he talked them into building a studio in the engineering center. And it wasn't a large studio, but it was large enough to do some local programs. And since we had to rely on local live programs, we only had one tape machine at that time. A lot of the programs were pretty bad, but they were interesting. The offices were in the engineering center, and then as the staff grew, we added a trailer in the engineering center that I managed to get from one of the Indian education programs. They were going out of business, and they had a double-wide trailer, so we hauled that over the parking lot, and the offices, part of the offices were located there, and then we also convinced the administration to build another studio, so we had 2 studios in the engineering center. Later on, when President Schwada was here, we managed to get a bill through to build a mass communication center, and we went over to the present facility that's located where Forest Avenue used to be, on Myrtle and Forest on the campus.
You mentioned that you only had one tape machine, everything was live. So sort of describe what was a day of programming like? How many hours did you broadcast?
I think that when we started out in '61, we had 5 hours weekdays. We didn't go on the air Saturday or Sunday. We stayed off the air in the summertime during summer vacation. We just didn't have enough the staff to stay on the air on a continual basis, and it progressed gradually. We finally were able to stay on in summers. We were able to stay on weekends, and as you know, it's now on the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
So what was those first programs? What kind of programs and who did them? How did
Well,
you do 5 hours of live programming?
Well, there were telecourses. As I say, we did Kino Martinez's Spanish program. We did the basic physical universe course with Dr. Yale. Dr. Stonke had been on local television stations. He was the Scorpion man, and we did The Living World with him, which was a biology telecourse. Beulah Crouch did a program in secondary education. We had Glenn Wilt offered business math. Those were the programs. And then we had the one newscast we did at 5 o'clock, 5 to 5:30 every evening.
What was the newscast like?
Terrible. It was just awful. I'm glad we don't have any tapes of that to show you. I did news. Shel Siegel did the stock market and sports, and Chuck Allen did the weather. Chuck built a Lazy Susan, and he would have a map of the United States, and he would talk about what was happening in the United States, and then he would physically turn it, and there would be a map of Arizona, and then he'd physically turn it again, and there would be the forecast. A couple of times we taped it down so he couldn't turn it. Shell did the stock market, and we had a lantern slide behind him, similar to the one you've got here, but this was a lantern slide. And we had a picture of Wall Street behind it. When the lantern slide got hot, it would disintegrate from the center. And we burnt Wall Street 4 or 5 times a week. You know, it just disintegrated. So the newscast was terrible, but we thought it was terrific at that time.
It's a shame there aren't any.
We didn't have any visuals. And, you know, if I was doing the news and a plane crashed, a TWA Constellation crashed over the Grand Canyon, I would put up a picture of the flying fortress that my wife had cut out of Life magazine. It would say, a plane similar to this crashed at the Grand Canyon today.
It's a shame there aren't any tapes of that.
Yeah.
And the courses they taught, they just taught them live for an hour or so?
Well, this was one of the problems you had trying to do a telecourse on a university campus. Television operates in 15-minute segments, or half-hour or hour segments. Telecourses operate in 50-minute segments, and the professors insisted that they do 50 minutes. So we had to fill 10 minutes at the end of every telecourse. I warned Dr. Stonke. I said, you know, you don't have students to talk to. You're on your own. You'll finish up before the course is over with all your lectures. Let's do a half hour, 4 or 5 days a week, rather than 50 minutes, 4 days a week. He insisted on doing 50 minutes. And guess what? He ran out of materials at the end of about 13 weeks, a 16-week course. After that, they decided it was better to go with the television format of a half hour rather than 50 minutes.
But they weren't taped, so they had to just do them again every...
No, they weren't taped, and I'll give you an example of what can happen when you don't tape a program. Dr. Stonke wanted to show that rattlesnakes can break a balloon with their fangs. And so we had to warm up balloons because he said they won't strike a a cold balloon. So we warmed up balloons and we put it down. And I think he spent 15 minutes trying to get this snake to strike the balloon, and without success. And since it was alive, he had to give up. And I think he probably said, "This shows you that rattlesnakes are not that dangerous."
Or they don't like balloons. Let's see. You probably have lots of other stories. Do you have any other particular events that stand out in your mind?
Well, after PBS got started, you recall that Nixon was president. He did not like public television. We found out later, when the tapes were released before he resigned, that he had told either Haldeman or Ehrlichman to do away with public television. The reason he didn't like it is there were some programs that criticized him. I don't know how this possibly, his hatred of public television could have filtered down to Arizona, but it seemed to me somehow it did. And in 1970, well, I think it was probably 30 years ago, 1972, the president of the Board of Regents, Paul Singer, testifying in front of the Senate Appropriations Committee, accused Channel 8 of broadcasting leftist programming, left-wing programming. And that was a nice way of saying communist-inclined programming. I never could figure out what he meant by left-wing programming, and they never identified it. But the committee had a couple of solid right-wingers on it, and they implied that the university budget would be held up, and possibly they would find some way of censoring programs that were left-wing programs on Channel 8. Naturally, Republic and the Gazette got a hold of this, and it was front page news. I got calls from all the television stations. It was very serious. I went to President Schwada and offered to resign if that would help. And he knew that Jack Williams and I had been friends, that I had worked for him, and he suggested I go down and talk with Jack and see if this was a serious program. So I went down to see the governor and told him what had happened. He knew what had happened, and I told him that I had offered to resign, that we thought it was a very serious problem. If that would help the budget situation, I would resign. And he said, "Oh, don't do that." And that made me feel happy. Then he said something like, "I don't want you to resign, because if you do, they'll turn that station over to some nutty professor." So I accepted his admonition and came back and told President Schwada that I didn't think that the problem was going to be that serious. It didn't quite go away, but the university budget was passed, and it did have Channel 8's budget within that umbrella. Another interesting sidelight to that, Justice O'Connor was in the legislature during one of these periods of time when we were having some problems. And I had talked to her about it. She was a friend of Channel 8. And she said, never lose the university's budget umbrella. By that, she meant as long as you're raising funds out that side, that's fine. But keep that basic foundation with the university, because that's an umbrella that can cover you in case some legislator or some governor doesn't like what you're doing. And she was so right. And even today, the university grants Channel 8 a budget every year, and it hasn't been shrinking, but the other part of it has been growing, so Channel 8's been able to survive very well during these last years.
I think Roy mentioned about the 60s being a kind of volatile time on campus with protests. Did Channel 8 get involved in any of that?
Yeah, these things seem so important at the time. There was a demonstration on campus, and the students came through the engineering center with their flags. And one of the students leading the parade was one of my students. I was his advisor. And they came through the office, and we had glass windows. in there, and they pounded on the windows going through, and they scared one of the secretaries. I thought she was going to have a heart attack. And I was really upset with this. His name was Ira Opper. And I called Ira Opper in, and I chewed him out like you wouldn't believe. And I told him there wasn't anything I could do about his grades, but I didn't appreciate what he was doing. Years later, I'm in Las Vegas looking at broadcast equipment at a broadcasting convention, where all the equipment was displayed. And a fella comes up to me and says, "You don't remember me?" And I said, "No." He's got a three-piece suit on, and he's standing next to some production equipment that he's selling. And he says, "I'm Ira Opper." I mean, he had changed completely, and he was part of the capitalistic system now. And we laughed about what had happened during the 60s. At ASU, they weren't nearly that serious. Of course, they were at places like Kent State. But I think the most damage that was done is when the students wanted to lower the flag at in front of the administration building. It's not there any longer. And there were pansies around it. The governor had said, "No, we're not going to lower the flag at half-mast." And this was to honor the students at Kent. And the students gathered around that, and our ASU police also gathered around this pansy place, and the students picked all the flowers. They let them pick the flowers, but they never lowered the flag. And, you know, that was about as serious as it got here on campus.
Destroying pansy beds.
Yeah.
Tell us about, you know, as the station grew, I'm sure your responsibilities grew. Well, you mentioned that after the station got on the air that everybody left and you were left in charge. Tell us about how the station grew and got its new building and all that.
Well, it grew not in leaps and bounds, but in small fractions. You know, we went from maybe 10 to 15 to 20 stations, and then 20 staff members. When the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was formed and received funds from the federal government, every station got a piece of those funds. And then we had the basic foundation with the university. We managed to get funds from the federal government through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and then we started fundraising locally. Now, we were told, I was told, that this was not possible. You could not raise underwriting funds. You couldn't get businesses in the community to underwrite programs unless you gave them commercials. Well, that proved wrong. They were willing to help us out. And at that time, we had a lot of local enterprises here. All the banks were local. The savings and loans were local, and we could go to them and ask them for support. So we did get support for Wall Street Week and Sesame Street and Masterpiece Theater. Then we started fundraising directly to the public, and we weren't the first to do this. Other stations had done this, and we were told again you couldn't do this, and this was amazingly successful. So we had these 3 or 4 different pots of money coming in, and we could hire staff. We hired staff through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and through our local funds. The university budget didn't grow that much, but it again gave us that foundation. So slowly but surely, we were able to gain more staff, hire more staff, and then we convinced the administration to put up a new building. The building was supposed to be, I may be wrong in the footage, but I'll be close, 144,000 square foot building. There were going to be the mass communication department, the speech departments, and Channel 8, and we were going to have 5 studios in the building, and our portion of the building would have been about 72,000 square feet. About half of the building was going to be Channel 8. One of the studios was going to be completely dedicated to the mass communication department. We wanted a 3-story building, and we wound up, as you know, with about 74,000 square feet and a 2-story building. I may wonder, why is it so important to have a three-story rather than a two-story building. Well, the studio is a two-story building, in a two-story building is about 24 feet high, and that's really too small to do the kind of production we wanted to do. But we managed to get 3 studios, and although the main studio, it was only 2 stories, it still was sufficient for us to do local programming. I might mention one other thing, maybe not important. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting's contribution to the stations was based on your local income. So the more non-taxable income you received from businesses and membership, the more money you got from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So if you were successful in raising money that way through the local membership and sponsorship underwriting, then you got more money from the federal government.
Tell us about how you started getting the local people involved in the first fund drives, the first pledge drives you did.
We had Friends of Channel 8 group that we successfully got together, and the reason we were able to do that, I had known Hugh Downs, and I went to Hugh and asked him if he would be the chairman of the formation of a friends group. And I thought with his name we would be able to attract people. He said he was willing to do that. I talked with the president and the president of the university and Mrs. Gamage, Catherine Gamage, and we invited some special people to a dinner with Hugh Downs. And there were 13 or 14 people that came to dinner, and that was the start of the Friends of Channel 8. And from that, we went into local on-the-air fundraising. I think the first time we went on the air, we maybe had 10 phone operators. I remember Irma Bombeck was one of the founders of the Friends group, and she came down to answer the phones. It was rather embarrassing. They were not ringing.
What year was that? Do you remember?
Oh gosh, I think we were in the new building, so it was probably in the late 70s.
That must have been quite a move into the new building. And,
oh, it was a wonderful move. And of course, we also were able to add new equipment. And we had more than one tape machine when we moved into the new building.
Where did you get your equipment? Was a lot of it donated at first?
At first it was donated. The cameras were donated by Channel 12, and they were Dumont cameras. And then they replaced their cameras, and we managed to get a couple of cameras from them. We applied for federal grants outside of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and we were able to get cameras via the federal grant proposals. So we were able, little by little, to add equipment.
Why don't you tell a little bit there, those cameras, that was black and white, and then it transitioned to color.
Yeah, we were the last station to go color, and again I went to the vice president and told him that we really needed to go color, and he went into President Durham. The vice president at that time was Joe Shabacker. He tells this story much better than I do, and I'm not sure it's all completely true. But I went into with him to see the president, and the president wasn't that interested in funding color because we had to change all the tape machines, the 1 or 2 tape machines we had, and all the cameras, the tower and antenna, transmitter, all that had to be changed and converted. So I went out and rented a color television station set, and I asked the president to keep that in his home and just watch us and watch the other stations. And he had said to me one time when he was watching The Age of Kings, I can hear the kings, but I can't see them. And that was because we had a terrible signal. And I mentioned that to him. Well, when he saw that there was such a difference between what we were airing and the other stations was airing, he said, let's see what we can do. And the other part of that is I'm red-green colorblind, and he thought it was rather ironic that a red-green colorblind station manager was asking him to convert the station to color. We did get some grants for that, and he did get some extra funds through the university to have us convert to color. It was quite an enterprise.
So talk a little bit more about, how the station changed, the university grew, and your career kind of grew.
Well, again, I can't think of any university that has grown as fast as Arizona State. If you consider that when I came here in 1948, there were 2,500, maybe 3,000 students, and today there are 50,000 students. You'd say, how did all of that happen? Well, you have to take a look at the community at the same time. I don't know how many people we had in Tempe when I came here. I would guess there would probably no more than 50,000 here and maybe 100,000 in the whole area. There are 3.5 million people here. This is a large community. So it was only natural that if the university was to grow that fast and that dramatically, the station latched onto those bootstraps and was able to build itself up at the same time. Why this happened? Well, I think the main cause of the growth in this area is refrigeration. I don't think that without the advent of refrigeration, we'd have this many people wanting to come here. The other thing was the GIs. Guys that had been stationed here came back after the war, and the GI Bill helped. So all of these things going together mushroomed the growth of both Channel 8 and the university. And of course, the other interesting thing is we became a university. A lot of people didn't think that was desired.
Looking back over your career, what do you see as the most memorable landmark sort of your career?
Marrying Frankie Joe. I really mean that. I needed that support to come over here to ASU from KOY to help me with my degree. I went back in the summertime to Case Western Reserve to get my master's degree. She took care of the kids. I went in the basement of my parents' home. They were living there, my stepfather and my mother, and I studied all summer. She typed all my papers. She did all of that work. And then when we came back here, she took care of the house. I took care of the finances, the huge finances, like what was going on at the university and the Channel 8 budget. She took care of the small things like the house payment, our checkbook. And I will say this, no matter what my salary was, she always managed to save some money. So when I retired, I was in pretty good shape because of the university retirement program and because of what she had done with our own savings. So yeah, that was the most important thing in my life.
Okay. Looking though a little bit more at your career at the university, are there what are the most notable?
Well, I think, Dick Bell leaving and becoming general manager of the station, and then later on Brent Brown asking me to come into the university relations office. That was a wonderful 3 or 4 years because I went over there in 86, 87, and you'll recall that we went to the Rose Bowl in 87. When we came out of the California game, Frankie Joe and I went to the Mission Palms. They had an alumni celebration. We beat California, and that meant we were going to the Rose Bowl. President Nelson said, I want to talk to you, and I want to talk to you and Brent Brown. So we went over to the alumni gathering, and the president asked me if I would help coordinate the Rose Bowl activity. And this was the first time the university had ever gone to the Rose Bowl. And I thought I didn't know if I wanted to do that. but he didn't have to convince me. I talked with Brent, and the president said, you know, just ask me what you want and we'll see what we can do. And I was able to pick the staff to help me with that Rose Bowl activity. And he told me that there were a couple things. He said, I don't want any financial problems with this, and I want it to be a first-class event. And I think we accomplished that. But I took off from nearly everything I did for several months, and we went to the Rose Bowl, and I think though everybody that was there thought it was a pretty good event. And I think that was, working for Brent helped me immensely.
Well, could you explain for people that aren't really immersed in the university, what university relations was and how you came to move over there?
University relations was formed probably in 1984 or 85, somewhere in there. Paige Mulholland appointed Brent Brown to be in charge of community relations, and then it expanded into university relations. The following activities departments reported to Brent: the ASU Foundation, Channel 8, publications, public events, and the Alumni Association, and he handled all the political activity that the university was getting involved in. So those were some of the enterprises that reported to Brent. When I came over, he parceled some of those out. He kept the foundation, and publications and the alumni, Channel 8, and public events reported to me. So he was responsible for the whole activity, but he was so busy with the legislature and bringing the Cardinals to town. Brent was responsible, maybe he doesn't want to admit it now, for the St. Louis Cardinals coming to Phoenix. And he had to work out agreements with the university for the use of the stadium, and then he had to work out agreements with some of the community leaders to build the press box and the boxes that were sold to enterprises in the area. So that's what university relations was. Then it became, after he left, institutional advancement, institutional advancement, thank you. And now I think it's public affairs. So it's one of those vice presidential offices that can change depending on what the president wants.
Well, we just saw that happen.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Looking back over your career, what are the things that you're proudest of?
Well, I think one of the things is the retirees organization. I retired, and Brent said there are a couple things we haven't done. We want a visitor center, and you've talked about forming something for the staff, a retirees organization for the staff. So he hired me back for a year to see if we could put some kind of organization together, and now the Arizona State University Retirees Association has both faculty and staff involved, and I think they've got over 1,000 members, and they're a real going concern. So that's one of the things I'm proudest of. I think the other thing, of course, is Channel 8, but it's been in great hands with Chuck Allen. When I left in 87 or 88 to go to university relations, he took over, and the station has just done marvelously well with Chuck. When you stop and think, there have only been 3 general managers of the station: Dick Bell for 6 months, and then myself and Chuck. And I just hope when Chuck retires, they find somebody else that can carry on that tradition. So those are a couple of things I'm proud of.
That's pretty incredible to have just 2 station managers.
I think nationally, I can't take full credit, but I think I can take partial credit for the formation of PBS. I was one of the original board members and chairman of the station management group, And then out of that, we formed the Pacific Mountain Network. So we've had a couple of enterprises that have been formed because people from the West and from this station have been involved.
Were there any challenges over the years that you look back on?
Well, funding for Channel 8 was an immense challenge, and still is, and will continue to be. I don't know where the future of Channel 8 lies. But again, remember when we came on the air, we were one of 5 stations. And today, Channel 8 is one of hundreds of cable opportunities available to people that have cable and satellite. So, you know, the fragmentation of this business and the entry of high-definition television is going to change the Channel 8 in the next few years. I don't know where they're headed, but I just hope that nationally and locally they can find their own niche in this fragmented spectrum. I also think that the university's got to find its own niche, and the new president is going to have to work on that. Community is not what it used to be when I worked at the university, and they're going to have their problems trying to continue to be a research university and have 50,000 students that they need to take care of. It's going to be a real challenge for the new president.
It's something of a challenge to run a television station within a university, too.
But, you know, again, it's a great foundation having it with the university. I mean, you've got the faculty resources that are available. And it is true that sometimes there are people that criticize the university system that budgets Channel 8 when the money is short on campus and probably could be used for good causes elsewhere. But I do think this station helps the image of the university with the community. Every station break says a service of Arizona State University, and that's what the university is. It's a service to the community, and in the true sense, I hope that Channel 8 continues that service of the university to the community. Not necessarily in courses anymore, but in broader services than telecourses.
Some of the PBS stations, though, that started at universities left that and became community stations.
Yeah, quite a few of them. University of Washington station became a community station. Even WGBH started at Harvard and then quickly became somewhat independent. A lot of the stations decided to become, that were university stations, become community stations. Now, I think the reason for that is the university decided that if they could, the station could operate on its own and didn't need university support. So that's probably one of the reasons why some of these stations have become community stations. Channel 8 has resisted that, and I think rightly so.
Was there ever a move to do that?
Was it what?
A move by people to try to take it away from the university?
Well, yeah, there have been several efforts, and one of them was in the 70s when it seemed like that the legislature was going to curtail the station's operation. But fortunately, that didn't happen. There have been a couple of efforts, and maybe the station would have been better off with a growing community to have been community stationed, but I kind of doubt it.
You know, one of the sort of challenging times was during the impeachment of Governor Meekum, and Channel 8 broadcast that. Can you talk about how that decision came about?
That came about because we had a program called Horizon that was on the air. It was on the air every night, every weeknight, and Michael Grant had been the host of that, and it still is. When the impeachment process came along, Chuck Allen decided to contact the other stations and see if Channel 8 could be the station of record. We would broadcast all of the impeachment hearings, and other stations could use whatever we had available to them any way they wanted to. So the station became the station of record for the impeachment hearings, and it isn't that Chuck didn't get criticism. A lot of people thought this was a terrible mistake, that we were trying to show up Governor Meekum, and again the left-wing accusations came up a little bit, but it proved to be a very wise decision. Another wise decision, and this was Chuck Allen's and Dan Durenberger's baby. Chuck came to me and asked me if he could look into broadcasting live an open heart operation. Now this was in the early days when open heart surgery wasn't that prevalent. And he had gone down and seen Ted Tietrich teach a class of doctors on television in a closed circuit system. Well, he came to me and asked me to do this, and I said, no, we're not going to take that. We'll tape it. Well, he didn't want to tape it. You do it live to show people that this can be done and it is safe, or if you want to tape it, that shows the public that it's not that safe. Well, after a long period, not a long period of time, we decided to do it live. And we offered it to PBS. They turned us down, but I think 14 or 15 stations picked up the live telecast. And I tell you, I sat in the office with Chuck and Joe Zesbaugh, who was president of the Pacific Mountain Network, who helped fund this broadcast. I sat on pins and needles throughout that whole operation, but it really was a breakthrough operation. And now heart operations are commonplace. I'm a recipient, and that tape is still used by hospitals to show what the operation is all about.
That was a big deal at the time to
Yeah.
put that on live. I remember that too. Any other major events like that that you haven't talked about?
Well, there are a lot of them. One was the death of a princess. BBC had broadcast a docudrama about a princess in Saudi Arabia that had an affair with a commoner, and both of them were either stoned or beheaded in public. The Saudi Arabian government didn't like that broadcast at all. PBS picked it up. And before the program aired, we were urged not to broadcast it. PBS was urged not to broadcast it. People thought that the Saudis were going to embargo the oil if we aired it. I received a letter from Senator Goldwater urging us not to broadcast this, and he was a great friend of public broadcasting and Channel 8. And we went ahead and aired it, and of course it wasn't nearly as bad as people thought it was going to be. It always bothered me that people would call us or write us and say, don't air a program that they had never seen. But it happens time and time again.
Let's see. We've covered most of the questions I have.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Can you remark on the association of KAET to the Cronkite School? What, in any way at all, Bob?
Okay. Back in the 60s, well, 50s, there were I started teaching and advising in 1959. First year, well, I guess it was 1960, the first year that I was here during a school session. I don't know how many students we had, maybe 40 students. Suddenly, that major, in the radio television major in the mass communications department, mushroomed. And I, at one time, advised 100 students and taught 3 or 4 courses every semester. We were short of faculty. The mass communications department changed titles to become telecommunications. And then Walter Cronkite was encouraged to lend his name to the school. And that was done through Tom Chauncey at Channel 10. It became the Walter Cronkite School of Telecommunications and Journalism. Channel 8 had always had students that worked at the station. For a while we had them working for credit, and we decided that wasn't a very good idea because then they had to work there whether they wanted to or not. So we felt it was better to have the students come on their own. And every semester we've had 40 to 70 students that have worked at the station in cooperation with the Walter Cronkite School. I taught up until the time I retired station management, but now the school has its own faculty, and they have a superb faculty. They've got nationwide attendance to the program and acknowledgement because of Walter Cronkite. Every year they have a huge luncheon where they honor some journalists in nationwide. They've honored the 60-minute staff. It's just a great school. I think the one problem they have, this is not from an outsider's viewpoint, is limiting the number of students that enter the school because they can only handle so much effectively, and I think they have over 1,000 students that are in the curriculum now, just in the telecommunications curriculum. But they've been able to keep pace with what's going on, and telecommunications is changing, and they have to be able to teach their students what's happening currently.
How do you see your legacy that you leave?
My legacy? Is there a legacy? I don't think so. I don't think there's a legacy.
Well, how would you like to be remembered then?
On my epitaph, it can say, "Buried here is the husband of Frankie Joe Lander."
No mention of ASU.
Well, you know, there's been so many people that contribute. It's very hard for one person to take credit for anything. You know, I can't take credit solely for the formation of the Retirees Association because Brent was involved initially. I had to have his legacy, his permission. Then we had a group of wonderful retirees that got together. They did all the work. It was just an idea. And I can't take responsibility for starting Channel 8. Dick Bell did that, and Jim Loper. And there's been so many people that contribute to these things that I don't think it's fair for one person to take credit for anything that they may mythologically think is their legacy.
But you kind of headed up Channel 8 for almost 30 years.
Yeah.
That's pretty incredible in this day and age.
Yeah, but again, you know, a lot of times I was in Washington at PBS meetings, and somebody was running the station here. And we always had great staff members. And I think Chuck would feel the same way. He's had great assistants. So you can go out of town, you can go to luncheons, you can do fundraising for the station without being right there because somebody else is running the station. And you know, if you ask me to produce a show, it would have to be the worst show you've ever seen. Or to direct, it'd be terrible.
But you used to do those things.
No, only when I had to. When somebody got sick or something.
Well, talk just briefly, we've seen broadcasting really change from the days when you got in it, and those radio stations and TV stations were owned by one man or one family and run kind of as a family operation, to today they're all being bought up and owned by big corporations.
Well, Channel 8's the only local station now. All of the other local stations, I mean local ownership, all the other local stations are owned by conglomerates. And when you think that Channel 3, I may be wrong by $1 million or so, sold for over $300 million, you realize why a local owner can't resist the temptation to sell the station. And all of them is sold. And when I started out at KOY, the radio stations were locally owned. They're no longer locally owned. What's going to happen? I have no idea, but I think the demise of local ownership has been a detriment to the community. I think it's been a detriment to Channel 8. I think it's been a detriment to the university. Because, you know, if you're going to go to Bank One for underwriting, who do you see? There was a time when I could call Walter Bimson and he would say, well, see so-and-so. Or I could call the publisher of the paper. The paper didn't like us initially, but later on I could call the publisher of the station and they would say, well, see Bill Shover. And we could get underwriting directly. Now it's my understanding you've got to go locally and then nationally, and sometimes you don't get through those channels. So it's going to be continually a problem for the university to raise funds nationally. They're probably going to have to have several people in that position to go to Chicago and New York and LA to talk with national organizations that are now owned by stockholders.
You say the paper didn't like Channel 8. Why was that?
Mr. Pulliam didn't like any tax money going to support television. He thought it was an encroachment on the taxpayers of this state to have any funds going to a television station. Initially, when we went on the air, we were not listed with the other stations. They boxed Channel 8's programming and they would put it over by the obituary page or maybe in the classified ads, but not in the television section. And but my understanding from one of the reporters that resigned from the paper, that a memo went out from Channel 8, from Mr. Pulliam saying, make Channel 8 obscure. He really didn't like us. But somehow we survived Mr. Pulliam, and later on we got all kinds of support from the paper. Even though it was locally owned by Pulliam's son, we got all kinds of support. I'll give you one example. The name Duke Tully may be familiar to people. Duke was publisher of the paper, and unfortunately he had expanded his resume to include being a pilot, the Air Force pilot in the Korean affair, and he never was. But anyway, Chuck Allen and I went to Mr. Tully for support, and he said, no, I won't give you a grant for any of the programs, but if you ever need anything on a one-time basis, special event basis, like if you want to do something from the legislature or nationally, give me a call. We had Robin McNeil come to town. The McNeil-Lehrer report was on the air at that time, and we wanted him to meet some of the contributors to the station. So I called Duke Tully. He talked to Bill Shover, and they let us use their ranch. You know, they have their Republic and Arizona Republic Ranch that's located in the area. And they furnished all the food and all the booze for over 300 people, 300 guests that we had to visit with Robert McNeil. That kind of support was just marvelous to get.
This is the one question I've asked everybody, and is to talk a little bit about advice that you give young people today that are trying to decide what they want to do with their lives or their careers.
I have four grandchildren. Ellis is 15, Wendy's 13, Avery's 9, and Kate is 8. And I have found out that I don't give them advice. If they ask for it, maybe, you know, if they ask, can I have ice cream tonight? Yeah. But to give them sound advice, I think that's their parents' job. And I just don't feel capable anymore of giving advice to students. I'll tell you what can happen to you. I had Al Michaels in class, and when the Cardinals came to town, he invited me to go to the broadcast booth because Monday night was airing a game between the Cardinals and the Dallas Cowboys. I went up there, and Dan Durendorf said to me, "I understand you were Al's advisor." I said, "Yeah." He said, "What kind of a student was he?" And I said, "Well, let me put it this way. I gave him a B in radio, television, announcing. Now, am I capable of giving advice to students when I give the premier sportscaster in the country a B when he was a student? I don't think so."
Well, he might have been a B then. You motivated him.
Well, he didn't go to class. That was one of his problems.
So that could motivate him to improve.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else that either of you wanted to ask?
Well, he didn't tell anything like, you know, with Frank Byers and stuff when we were students, but that's okay.
I can.
Huh?
You can cut this out. June Payne and I were in the drama workshop. Now, as I said, when you went to school here in the 50s, in the 60s, early 60s, if you wanted to participate in dramatics or the choir or debate, just show up. I showed up and got a small part in The Doctor in Spite of Himself, or one of Moliere's plays. And after that, Frank Byers, the drama director, helped me get into every one of the plays that I auditioned for, but he also helped me get the job at KOY because he called Jack Williams and said, "I have a young man that I think would be a help to your station." Now, Dean McSloy was a debate coach, and I went to him one day and said I was interested in debate, and guess what? I wound up on the debate team. Not a very good debater, but those were the advantages that you could really have in a small school. I hope that students can still take advantage of extracurricular activities, and I'm sure they do. If you go to any of the music presentations on campus and hear the symphony orchestra or the concert band, they're marvelous, much better than they were when I was a student. And I guess the same thing's true with the drama department. A big school offers a lot of opportunities too.
Did you ever think of actually making acting your career?
Oh yeah, I went over to the coast in 1953 before I went to work for KOY, right after I graduated, and it was really difficult. I auditioned for a couple of plays. At that time, the film industry was kind of dying. They didn't know what was happening with television. They weren't producing yet for television, so everything was at a standstill. And I was offered a job at Channel 5, so I came back from the coast to take this job. A friend of mine, Tom Sherlock, had told me they had an opening, and I auditioned, got the job, went back to the coast to clean up some of the material that I had over there. I was working for Northrop at the time, Northrop Aviation. Came back and they filled the job. And I was out of work, but that's when I went to KOY.
So you might have gone to work at KOY.
KPHO, yeah.
Become a great news anchor or something.
Huh?
Might have become a great news anchor.
Oh, yes, yes.
If you hadn't chosen your career path as it turned out, was there anything else you would have liked to have done?
You know, I did go to work for the Cleveland Electric Illuminating Company to be the third generation. I worked there for one summer in the survey department, and then they asked me to stay on, and I stayed on for a full year after that before I came back to ASU. I think I would have stayed there but for the advice of one man. His name was Ralph Rolfe, and he asked if I was going to stay on, and I said, yeah, you know, the salary was pretty good, and I enjoyed what I was doing. And he said, you know, I've been here 25 years, and let me tell you, after you've been here 20 or 25 years, there's no place to go. He said, you can't go up, and you can't go down, and you're stuck. And I thought about that when I came back here and went to work for KOY, and he was right. I've never been really stuck in a job. I've been in a job at Channel 8 for 30 years that I love, but I never felt like I was really stuck there as something I had to do.